Our next talk is by Nolan. You should wave to him here. Everyone says hello. And he is going to be talking about what would Lewis do?
Okay, thanks Anthony. Thanks so much for inviting me. So David Lewis had a lot to say about ethics and about metaethics, but he didn't seem to have a systematic view, at least in ethics, or at least there's not a published systematic view. And that's unlike some other parts of his philosophy where, as he famously said, he didn't aim to be a system builder, but then he ended up being a system builder. But what I want to talk today about is a tension between two aspects of his view. So he had various contributions he made to metaethics, and it's very easy to read those contributions as consequentialist friendly or even roughly in the consequentialist spirit. Maybe that's just because I'm from Australia and we read everybody that way. But when you look at his first order views, are definitely not consequentialist. He's definitely an anti-consequentialist. And the ways he's an anti-consequentialist make it hard to see how the metaethical contributions and the ethical contributions are meant to fit together. Now, I should say, when I'm saying hard to see how to put together, I don't mean I've got a killer argument they can't be put together or anything like that. It's just an interesting puzzle to address how they fit together. And I suspect the most natural fit might end up being his metaethical views with certain kinds of consequentialism, but I also want to explore what kinds of anti-consequentialist approaches he might take advantage of if he wants to hold the package of what's apparent in his published writings. Okay, and I'm interested in this partly as a question of intellectual biography and partly because chances are Lewis would have something interesting to think or say about this. But I'm also interested because some of the moves he makes in the metaethical domain are popular well beyond his own views, and some of the views he has, the kind of anti-consequentialist intuitions he relies on in the first order case, there are plenty of anti-consequentialists around. It still seems to be a majority, at least going by things like the Pill Paper Survey. Okay, so yeah, I'm interested in exploring Lewis's views, but with an eye to exploring the tenability of the combinations of the views, not just exegetical questions about what Lewis might have had in mind. Okay, so let me talk about the first apparent tension, and I've called it a trilemma. If you try to extract a deductive argument straightforwardly from it, you won't find a good one. Well, at least I haven't found a good one. But I want to set it up this way to kind of fill in the gaps to show you why you might think there's a question to be answered here. Okay, so the trilemma, flat-footedly, Lewis has a theory of practical rationality. Ideally, practical rational beings are probabilists, update Bayesian in a Bayesian way. They're causal decision theorists. They in his terminology, maximize utility, or expected utility, maximize utility given their credences. And that's what they do. And that's pretty much all they do, right? They like the Terminator, they just go out there, they've got this value function, and they keep picking the best. Occasionally they get some choices if there are equally best options, and those at the top of their option list, but that's about it. Okay, the correct moral theory, according to Lewis, is an anti-consequentialist one. And you might think, if anti-consequentialism is going to play much of a role, it should sometimes get in the way of picking the option with the highest moral value, right? So if you're an anti-consequentialist, but your list of do's and don'ts tell you to always pick the consequentially best option, that's not much of an anti-consequentialism, right? You're basically agreeing about what you should do, and then maybe have some disagreements elsewhere. Lewis seemed to be more than that. Lewis seemed to think consequentialism gave you the wrong answers about what to do, and the wrong answers about how to behave morally, not just some question about the explanation of why you should behave the way consequentialists say. The third part of the trilemma, as far as I could tell, Lewis thought it was entirely consistent to be ideally rational and ideally moral. So I'm not saying any actual beings like that, but he's not a kind of Kierkegaardian that somehow rationality gets in the way of the right kind of take on the world. And when he's talking about what to do when the moral stakes are important, he often wheels out the machinery of decision theory, uncertainty about various sorts of things, comparisons of outcomes. When he's talking about nuclear deterrence, or even what you should do in a faculty hiring meeting where the stakes are only slightly less high, it's the machinery. It looks like it's the machinery of decision theory in the background as an ideal limit for what we limited creatures should be doing. Okay, so apparent trilemma. There are cases where it's morally wrong to maximize moral value. The rational Lewisian agent's going to be maximizing value, and that agent could be entirely moral. Okay, stated like that, it looks inconsistent. The first natural thing to say is, look, this is equivocating on value. The thing that the quantity the rational Lewisian agent is maximizing is something like what they desire, or expected utility. It's a little bit more complicated because it's a causal decision theorist, but it's more or less given by what you desire and given by your hypotheses about how your actions are going to affect the world. But moral value, even I'll come to this later, he's somewhat of a subjectivist, so there's not no connection here. But there's no reason to think that moral value lines up with what you happen to want, even when you're rational. Or at least you'd have to argue for that. So the first thing to say about this trilemma is it's equivocating on value. There's two kinds of quantities here. The second premise says don't always maximize quantity number two. First premise says always maximize quantity number one when you're ideally rational and ideally moral. No contradiction. But there's a puzzle here, because the ideally rational and ideally moral agent is doing this running around picking the best option all the time. And it's easy to see how you could be entirely rational like that and entirely moral if you're a consequentialist. Or it's much easier to see, right? Your personal utility function will be very similar to the moral evaluations. When one world is better than another by the lights of evaluations of moral value, typically one world will be better than another by the lights of your own utility function. But what's the ideally rational anti-consequentialist, or ideally rational agent who is sometimes forbidden for picking the best, morally speaking? What's their value function look like? How could it be that they can always maximize this first quantity without ever violating, without ever, even across circumstances where they're obliged to not maximize the second quantity? If they're a good person, won't they just have internalized, won't a big part of that be that they've internalized values similar to what the moral values are? Okay, so what's wrong if you're ideally rational and a big part of your utility function is similar to or identical to the moral evaluative function? What's gone wrong with that person? It doesn't look like it's a rational failing. Lewis looks like he's got to think it's a moral failing, but it doesn't seem like a bad way to be. And what else are you supposed to be maximizing? But isn't it perverse to be a moral agent who is picking the worst rather than the better? Now, put like that, it can just look like a typical consequentialist intuition pump, and anti-consequentialists have got used to saying, yeah, sometimes you have to pick not the best. Let me say a little bit more about why it matters that the anti-consequentialist might have to say that you're required to pick something less than the best. Because you might initially think, look, consequentialists are hung up on picking the best, but it's just a wide open question for the anti-consequentialist whether the best is always a permissible option. And that comes back to the kind of the difference it's supposed to make. So if you're the kind of anti-consequentialist who thinks it's the wrong approach, even if it gets the recommendations about what to do and what to choose correct, then I think there is intellectual space for that, but it's not a radical enough anti-consequentialism to fit Lewis's remarks, I think. I think Lewis thinks the consequentialist, or at least typical, relatively plausible consequentialist views, insofar as any are plausible, just get it wrong about what to do and how to be. And they don't just get it right for the wrong reason. Maybe that's the thing to press on, right? Maybe Lewis should be the kind of anti-consequentialist that never disagrees with the consequentialist about what to do. Or at least never disagrees with the right consequentialist about what to do. That's an option, and I'll come back to it. But on the face of it, it seems to me there's a tension, because we need to have a theory of rational action that goes together with decisions about what to do not being determined by values of the outcomes. Or at least that would be the natural way to implement an anti-consequentialist view that's supposed to make a difference about what to do. But Lewis wants a kind of maximizing based on the values of outcomes conception of rationality, and an anti-maximizing or even satisfying, even being permitted to do the best conception of how to do the right thing, the morally right thing. Okay, so let me say a little bit about some of these pieces, and then say how I think Lewis should try to resolve this problem. And then I want to talk about a different kind of apparent conflict between his meta-ethical view and his ethical views. And this conflict, I'm less confident that there's a satisfactory response to it. But let me talk about the conflict I've set up the start of the paper with. Okay, so Lewis defends causal decision theory as, well, it's not clear what it is. I think it's a theory of how certain kinds of idealized rational agents work. One reason to think it's an idealization is he sometimes says, look, creatures like us aren't like this. Creatures like us don't have rich enough credences, don't have, or rich enough degrees of belief, don't have rich enough utility distributions. Now, you could think that's just condemning us as irrational, and sometimes we talk in a way that fits that. Or you could think, well, we can't be expected to behave like the ideally rational agents of decision theory, but we can still be evaluated by that yardstick, right? That maybe we are rational insofar as we do well enough, or something like that, as measured by that yardstick. Or maybe he's got very high standards. Maybe he thinks any departure from that standard is a failure of practical rationality. It's just that it would be silly to pick on people for a lot of those. Right? So the most rational human beings in the world aren't much like the hyper-rational Bayesian calculators, but it's silly to pick on the people doing very well by those standards when there's so many people doing very badly by those standards to fix first. Okay, and Lewis doesn't quite have a maximized value conception, where value is how you desire, well, a measure on worlds given by your desires. He has a view where what you maximize is what he calls utility, which is something like maximize the value that's under your control, or to some extent under your control, or not entirely outside your control. So given a dependence hypothesis, maximize value. That's a very rough sketch, and I don't want to try to articulate his particular kind of causal decision theory here. But one thing that's true even about his view is that his recommendation, his causal decision theory recommendation about what ideal agents should be like, those ideal agents are still maximizing values. And those values are determined by a combination of their desires and their credences, particularly credences about what he calls dependence hypotheses, how the world depends on their actions and what actions they have available, what their options are as well. Okay, and another question is, what kind of recommendation is this to maximize the quantity that causal decision theory recommends you maximize? I think it's something like practical rationality. That word's fought over, and my guess is Lewis might think, if you want to use that word for something else, give me a different word. I think he would, I think, but I'm not sure, that he would think that it's tied to something like the subjective ought for rationality. So that maximizing, it's crucial, it's maximizing expected utility, this quantity. So don't just, the rule isn't maximize the value you've got control over, very roughly speaking. It's do what you think has the best expectation for maximizing that quantity. Okay, but it's still a maximizing conception, and it's a maximizing conception that makes practical rationality very much subject to what the agent's desires are, which is perhaps not surprising given the kind of Humean flavor of his philosophy of mind. Okay, so that's what it is to be practically rational. What is it to do morally well, or to be a good person, or to do the right thing, whatever? So Lewis is not a consequentialist about that. Quote here, consequentialism is all wrong as everyday ethics. It's all wrong, at least as of 1984. So he's not. One thing that interpretive challenge, well, one interpretive challenge in the background is I'm drawing remarks of Lewis's from different times. A lot of them are clustering around the mid to late 80s, but there's always a chance that the views underwent quite a bit of change at various points. They seem to be, I'm not noticing big changes across his remarks at different times, but it's always an interpretive option that some of the apparent tensions are because he just changed his mind about important stuff. Okay, so different people include different things under the heading of consequentialism. So maybe it's pretty close to the core that what ought to be done and what's permissible to be done is somehow a function of the moral value of outcomes, where outcomes are included, taken broadly to include the action itself. So if you like singing loudly, then, well, if it's morally good to sing loudly, then you singing loudly, the moral value of that singing loudly is part of the value of the outcome. It doesn't have to be sort of causally downstream of the action. It can include the action itself. But people want to add a lot of just other things to that very general slogan, that the right's a function of the good. Traditionally, a lot of people have thought that consequentialism, properly so-called, should be agent neutral, that there should be a single value or set of values that all agents should be striving towards. That's become a lot less common to use the word consequentialism that way. A lot of people now want to say that so-called agent-relative consequentialism is a kind of consequentialism. If you're an agent-relative consequentialist, you think what's permissible and what's right is a function of moral value, but that different people might have different moral values. So, for example, an agent-relative consequentialist might think it's good to benefit your own family. Maybe it's more good to benefit your own family than to benefit strangers. But that gives different ones of us different values because we belong to different families. Like, I help my brother, that's better by my moral standards than if you help my brother. Whereas if you help your brother, that's better by your moral standards, not as good by my moral standards. The question of what really consequentialism is, I'm not very interested in. The reason I bring up the question of agent relativity is it might make a difference in interpreting some of Lewis's remarks. Lewis seems to be a fan of agent relativity for morality. Sometimes his things that he says that look like objections to consequentialism look like they're objections to agent neutrality. So, yeah. It might be that when he says consequentialism's all wrong, he means consequentialism where the only moral values are agent neutral. That's all wrong. I suspect it's stronger than that. I think even give the consequentialist agent relative values, Lewis is still going to think it's all wrong as everyday ethics. There's a couple of other things that you might think go on. Some people think that consequentialists are or should be maximizing consequentialists, that the only options that are morally permissible are the ones that score the best among the available options for the moral value of the outcomes. Others are satisficers. You have to do well enough. Cards on the table happen to be a satisficer. I think you can have done what you ought to do and have a tea break. You saved 1 million refugees rather than 1,000,003 because you read the Sunday paper. I'm not throwing stones. Not just I don't think there's any point blaming people like that, but I just don't even think it's wrong. Or if you think that's too high stakes and that's the case you should maximize, pick something less. There was some minor benefit that you didn't distribute as much as you could have because you took a break. Okay, so another thing that you could occasionally include, and maybe traditional consequentialism included, was a unity of the good thesis. That there was, there's two versions of this. One is that there's one kind of moral good. Now, even G.E. Moore didn't think that. He thought there were lots of different goods. But, for example, Benthamite utilitarianism, well, even there it's a bit difficult. But if you think the balance of pleasure and pain is one thing and not just made up of pleasure and pain, that's a unity of the good. Lewis is a pluralist about moral value, as far as I can tell. Not just that there are many things that are morally good, and that's not to be explained by some single value that they fall under, but he also seemed to be suspicious about certain kinds of aggregation. I think sometimes he thought, look, there's a bunch of moral considerations here. Maybe some of them point in different directions. What's the story in the end? Should you do that? Should you be that way? Should you produce that outcome? No overall answer, just partial answers. So, on page 3 of my handout, this is a case where Lewis is talking about a unified moral judgment about a person. And this is a person who's engaged in what's known as paradoxical deterrence. Lewis is kind of suspicious that actual agents ever needed to do this, but the idea of paradoxical deterrence is you set yourself up so that you're conditionally prepared to do something horrific. And you do that for a good moral reason. Basically, for example, to deter someone. So, the particular case people were talking about, I'm sitting in front of my nuclear button. Basically, the only thing my nukes can do is destroy enemy cities. I form the intention to launch if the enemy launches. And why do I do that? So the enemy will be deterred and not launch. Morally good thing to do, to deter the enemy from not launching. I may have saved millions of lives. Of course, if the enemy launches, then I press the button and I do something horrific. But you might think I'm horrific already because I'm already disposed to press that button and exterminate millions. And as Lewis points out, not just enemy combatants, but infants and slaves and all kinds of people who didn't have it coming. You might even think people who do have it coming shouldn't be burned to cinders by nuclear fire. But he says, okay, what do we say about that person, or that man in this example? He's a man who does right and would do wrong. He's a strange mixture of good and evil. That's what to think of him. Isn't that enough? Why do we need a simple, unified summary judgment? Now, if there were a last judgment, we had to decide whether to send them to heaven or hell, then we need a unified judgment. But we don't believe in the last judgment, and the people who do, well, they can leave it for the judge. Right? Now, that's about, I take it, an evaluation of character or an evaluation of a person, but I suspect he may have had the same kind of view about what we ought to do. So he talks about he seems sympathetic to what's called genuine moral dilemmas in a paper called The Trap's Dilemma. He also seems sympathetic to genuine dilemmas of virtue, right? Sometimes there might not even be an honest thing to do, because honesty might require two incompatible courses of action, like keeping an oath and lying. Lie because you've sworn to do something that requires lying to achieve. If he thought there were genuine moral dilemmas, one way to understand that is there's a kind of failure of aggregation. There's this consideration, it points towards fying. This consideration points towards not fying. And there's no further answer whether all things considered you should fy. That's not the only way to take it. You could also think in a genuine moral dilemma, there is a further answer, or maybe there are two further answers. All things considered fy, all things considered not fy. I need to go back and look carefully to try to work out exactly what Lewis thought about moral dilemmas. As far as I can tell, he hedged on that question. Okay, so Lewis says some things that can look very harsh about consequentialism, but some of them are modified to make it clear that he's not talking about consequentialism in general, but talking about very specific versions. So this is a relatively early, back on page 2, where he criticizes radical utilitarianism, stark and unqualified. I think there he means not even just utilitarianism, which would be pretty, or say million utilitarianism, but utilitarianism with all the bells and whistles shaved off. And he describes it as the strange doctrine that nothing at all matters to what ought to be the case except the total balance of good and evil. That any sort or amount of evil can be neutralized as if it had never been by enough countervailing good, and the balancing evil and good may be entirely unrelated, whereas the harm I do to you is cancelled out by the kindness of one margin to another. And you might think, hang on a minute, I'm a consequentialist or I'm a utilitarian. I don't believe this stuff. Neutralization of evil by good? I mean, it's outweighed, it wasn't neutralized. Entirely unrelated? I'm choosing options here. If this option includes me harming you and Martians being kind to each other, and this option doesn't include the Martians being kind to each other, then something about what I did has to be influencing whether the Martians are kind to each other. So they're causally related. That's not unrelated. Anyway, but I think Lewis would say, yeah, I'm talking about radical utilitarianism, stark and unqualified. I'm not talking about causal decision theory utilitarianism. I'm not talking about utilitarianism that leaves some role, say, for apologies or guilt or things like that that can be picked up on. It matters whether there's an outweighed evil or not. I think this isn't a condemnation of consequentialism in general. I put it on the handout partly because it gives you a flavor of the kind of thing he didn't like about consequentialism, even if the details I don't think he would have thought was right about consequentialism in general. The quotes on the top of page 3 give a sense of Lewis's own views without giving too many details. Especially the first quote makes it look like Lewis was similar to a lot of contemporary virtue ethicists. Thinks of morality in terms of virtue and honor, desert, respect and esteem, loyalty, affections and solidarity. So loyalties, affections and solidarity might go well beyond virtues, right? Because whether or not I'm a loyal person or whether I'm a person who exhibits the virtue of displaying solidarity, and whether I'm in fact in solidarity with people, they come apart. And you might care about the solidarity and not just the disposition to display solidarity. Of course, our moral aims are egocentric. So that looks like it's a rejection of agent neutrality, right? I want things to go well by standards relative to me. And he attributes that to the kind of virtue ethicist he is, or the kind of people who think like he does. And he suggests this for deontologists too. Likewise, all the more for those who think of morality in terms of rules, rights, and duties, or obedience to the will of God. The idea behind that is, if you think it's all about rules, there's a kind of stay in your own lane thought. Your job is to not lie, cheat, or steal. Maybe there's lying and cheating and stealing going on, and maybe you can prevent a lot of it by lying and cheating and stealing yourself. Don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal. Right. Whereas the consequentialist might think, look, lying's bad, so I should prevent the lying. And whether or not it's mine might be a practical relevance, not really a moral relevance. From the point of view of the universe, if I can get the lying and cheating and stealing down, whether or not I'm the one doing the remaining lying and cheating and stealing doesn't matter as much. Lewis also suggests that ethics shouldn't be universalistic, so the kind of agent-neutral canonical values, like the balance of pleasure over pain. Ethics of our world is quite universalistic enough, but even in ethics of our world, where we take into account everyone and everything, it's already too universalistic because it's a betrayal of our particular affections. That can make it look like he thinks there should be no agent-neutral value. Right? If I've got any agent-neutral value and I care about all my world mates and whether they're in pain, I've betrayed my particular affections. I think that would be an uncharitable read. I think he thinks if you think only the agent-neutral stuff matters, you've betrayed the particular affections. As I'll explain, yeah. But, yeah, so concern about agent relativity and egocentricity of moral requirements, a concern about a suspicion of universalization and universal values, and a suspicion and a focus on things like virtue and honor. You know, what am I disposed to do, and how did I manifest those dispositions? That seems to be closer to where the action's at than did pleasure outbalance pain, or did autonomy outbalance unfreedom, or something like that. Okay, so I haven't included every piece of Lewis saying a little bit about the kinds of things he thought were the ways to approach ethics, but that should give you a sense of somebody who looks pretty anti-consequentialist. But I should say that consequentialism and considerations of value, even considerations of agent-neutral value, had to be playing some kind of role in Lewis's overall system. And the quote at the top of page 4 is a case of this. So he's talking about, again, nuclear deterrence, and again, the situation of what do you do when you're sitting at your button, or you're sitting in your submarine, or you're sitting in your bomber, and the really bad news comes through. Right? The enemy's launched. You get the command to go and hit the city, or hit the missile field next to the city, or whatever it is. And he points out that, look, there's all these considerations of millions of lives at stake, both the enemy's lives, but also the lives that you might save on your own side by knocking out the enemy's missile field, or command and control, or whatever you might hope to do to help your side by dropping nuclear weapons on the enemy. And he says, look, it's also true that these people have sworn an oath, and they're patriots, and all of that kind of thing. And he says, I do not at all mean to set aside reasons of honor as morally weight. So the fact that they swore an oath to follow these orders, and they swore an oath to protect their side, he thinks those are not morally weightless, as perhaps a radical utilitarian might think. But he says, I do think it's fade into insignificance when the stakes get high enough. And this is the full the starting quote I gave context. Consequentialism is all wrong as everyday ethics, but right is a limiting case. So that's my argument on the consequential reasons why it'd be right to obey. So even if all the considerations of virtue and duty, perhaps per impossible, face one way, if there's a million innocent lives in the balance on the other side of the balance, be a consequentialist, save the babies, right? So it's got to be that agent-neutral value plays a role, is a source of reason, or something like that, even if, for some reason, it's all wrong as everyday ethics. So maybe all wrong is hyperbole there, but a suggestion anyway is that when you're maximizing expected value in everyday circumstances, it's not because of the agent-neutral value. It's because of virtue and honor and praise and blame and desert and all those sorts of things. Okay, so this makes me think that at least in everyday cases, Lewis is going to think there are cases where maximizing expected moral value requires one thing, and acting with honor and virtue and following the rules and all that thing requires something else. If it's not, then it's pretty strong hyperbole to say all wrong. If consequentialism got every recommendation about what you ought to do is right, it would be churlish to say it was all wrong, even if you had some theoretical disagreement elsewhere. I don't think Lewis was being churlish. I think he thinks consequentialism gives the wrong recommendations for action in everyday cases, not just the right recommendations for the wrong reasons. Okay, so what should Lewis do? Lewis thinks in everyday cases, well, here's what seems plausible. He's going to think that in everyday cases, insofar as you're rational, what you're doing is you're maximizing some quantity that's a matter of what you want, your evaluations outcomes. And in everyday cases, when you're doing the right thing, you're not, your actions are relatively insensitive to what maximizes moral value, at least directly. There's a way of looking at this where it doesn't look as strange as it might first look. And I have to admit, it did look very strange to me initially. Maybe, again, this is an expression of consequential prejudice. Now, there was a phase in the late 90s where every few years somebody would publish a paper showing that a wide range of views would be consequentialized. That is, you come up with a formally consequential theory that agreed with recommendations about what they ought to do with apparently non-consequentialist theories. And so I agree with a lot of those people. I think for a very wide range of theories about what to do and how to be formulated as anti-consequentialist theories, you can put up some value that acting to maximize that value will yield the same recommendations for action. Maybe it's hard to do with genuine moral dilemmas, as Campbell Brown's pointed out, and maybe it's hard to do with a few other things that some deontologists and virtue theorists want to put into their theory of action, or theory of moral action. But for a lot of these views, right, so there are tricks like take keeping promises just as one of the values, and the more promises, the better. And breaking a promise to ensure more promise keeping, take that to be really bad. It's so bad that you would rather people around you break a lot of promises than that you break a promise to maximize the quantity of promise keeping, among others. Because it's outweighed by this other value you have, which is, yeah. So the thing about a lot of these consequentialized theories is the moral value or the set of moral values they postulate look pretty weird. On the face of it, it doesn't look, per se, morally heavily disvaluable to break a promise to keep other promises, so that other people keep other promises. And the anti-consequentialist is going to say, I don't even think that's bad. Maybe it's good if more promises are kept ahead of experiments. But it's just, you're not allowed to. You're just not doing what you ought to do if you break your promises so that other people keep theirs. Or you engage in violence against innocents to lower the amount of violence against innocents later. Great. I love lowering violence against the innocent. That's great. I think that's morally valuable. But I just think you ought not do that. Or if you're a virtue theorist, yeah, they're a devil's bargain. I get the opportunity to corrupt myself to protect others from corruption. That lowers the level of corruption overall. That's nice. That might even be morally valuable. But that's not the way to be, because that's corrupt. And don't be corrupt. Right? So I think what anti-consequentialists should say about these consequentialized this arguments is, yeah, there are formally equivalent views that give the same outcome about what you ought to do, but they are wrong reasons analysis. They treat things as being morally valuable when they're not morally valuable, or at least not very morally valuable, not as morally valuable as they treat. So I think what a Lewisian should do is say the same thing about practical value, that some things like virtues or obligations, when I'm aware of those virtues and obligations, my utility function or my choices, my preferences change so that I don't break those rules or I don't behave in vicious rather than virtuous ways, but not because I think moral value is a matter of obeying the rule. Well, even practical value is all of it. But what I ought to do or how I ought to be is somehow a function of my practical values, right? That I'm not a consequentialist. I don't think what I morally ought to do is a matter of what's valuable, not even what's practically valuable. So I'm still thinking about the best ways. There are lots of ways of trying to do this, but let me give one illustration of the kind of line of thought that I want to offer to Lewis, or would offer to Lewis. So forget about moral obligations for a second, and just consider social obligations, or even military obligations. The ideally rational person has joined the army, and the captain's shouting orders at them. Now, what they want to do is be a good soldier, follow orders, not get in trouble, those kinds of things. That's what they want to do. The captain says, march up the hill and plant the flag. And they become, let's call it, militarily obliged to march up the flag and march up the hill and plant the flag. What we shouldn't think is that moral obligation is somehow a function of their utilities over outcomes. Instead, what we should think is the presence of that command, the presence of that obligation, changes their preference about what to do. There's two ways of doing this. One, you could say their desires stay the same and their means and beliefs change. So they have a desire to follow orders, they gain the means and belief that marching up the hill and planting the flag will be following orders. So that's what they do. Or you could talk about it as a desire shift. They used to not desiring going up the hill and planting a flag, and now they do. Maybe this is an instrumental desire caused by their desire to follow orders. So the order of explanation of them going up the hill and planting the flag isn't, well, they have this desire function, it gives the highest values to marching up the hill and planting the flag, and that's why they ought to march up the hill and plant the flag. The order of explanation is different. They ought to march up the hill and plant the flag, and they realize that, and now that's why their preferences rank going up the hill and planting a flag really highly. So it's the wanting to do what you ought, or wanting to be virtuous, discovering various kinds of things are your obligations or are the virtues, and then acting that way. That doesn't put what you ought to do, what's virtuous, downstream of your practical evaluations of actions or your moral evaluations of actions. It's not downstream of your moral beliefs. So in a moral case, suppose duty appears to me and instructs me to send a check for $100 to Oxfam, and then she disappears. And I'm an anti-consequentialist, so I don't believe that that's the best thing I can do right now. Maybe I think I'd be sending it to a different charity, or maybe I think something else. But what I do is I recognize that duty, some desire not to maximize moral value, but maybe to carry out my moral duties or do what duty says, kicks into place, and I write the check and send off the letter. Now, you might worry that this is making too many of the desires of the anti-consequentialist about moral matters, so you could also shift it so that it's about the things that underpin the obligations or the virtues. Like, when my friend's in trouble, it's implausible to think what happens is I have a desire to be a good friend. Well, this is the only thing that's going on. I have a desire to be a good friend. I notice this person's my friend. I notice that being a good friend involves comforting them, so I comfort them. Presumably, at least part of what should be going on is that I should want to alleviate their distress. And that might flow from my virtue of being a good friend. So there are kinds of options here where I could be a maximizing agent. I have these desires to go and comfort my friend, and I do my best to do that. But that doesn't explain the obligation or the virtue. The obligation or the virtue might even be prior in the order of explanation. So anyway, that was a little murky. We can come back to it in question time. I want to talk about the second thing. I may not have left myself enough time, but let me talk quickly about the second thing. So Lewis was basically a subjectivist about moral value. He described it himself as subjectivism with bells and whistles. That is, what's morally valuable to me is ultimately, to some extent, a matter of what I want. In particular, what's valued in general for me is what I would desire in certain idealized circumstances. And those certain idealized circumstances are appropriate kinds of imaginative acquaintance with the thing that would be desired if I desired to. Okay, so the exact subjectivism is a little complicated, but the general idea is you start with what I want and how I would behave in various idealized circumstances because of my actual psychological makeup. And that's the story about what is valuable for me, including what's morally valuable for me. And Lewis says, in some sense, this makes value contingent. Sometimes he says, look, you can avoid it being contingent if you wanted to rigidify, but that would keep it kind of something like contingent. Now, there's many things to object to about subjectivism, but one nice thing about subjectivism is it gives you a relatively unmysterious story about the connection between what is morally valuable and what your motivations in fact are. So a lot of moral theorists, for some reason, want it to turn out that either what is morally valuable has some kind of internal connection to your motivations, or what you think is morally valuable has an internal connection to your motivations, or something in the neighborhood, or does have a connection in idealized circumstances of some sort. If you're a subjectivist, you can say, here's why something being morally valuable has a claim on you. It's because it being morally valuable is a matter of which things have motivational claims on you. Basically, if I want to convince you to bring about some moral value, your motivational, given that it's morally valuable for you, your motivational set guarantees a motivational connection to that thing. Now, for Lewis, it ends up a little bit indirect. Right? So even if it was just what you desired to desire, you might say, look, I desire working in the soup kitchen, but I just really don't want to. But I have an indirect grip on your motivations. I can kind of say, look, you want to be the kind of person that wants to work in the soup kitchen. Work on yourself, right? Bring it about. Maybe make yourself that kind of person by going and working in the soup kitchen or something like that. Right? Now, it being something you genuinely value isn't even what you desire to desire. It's what you would desire to desire in various kinds of idealized circumstances. But hopefully the idea is that isn't too far from reality in various ways. I can get you to do a bit of imaginative acquaintance, line your desires to desire up with that, and then if you have the right kind of desire coherence, or you're the right kind of person who aims to desire coherence, or even has very good self-control and tends to end up wanting what you want to want, you'll do the rest and get yourself to the point where you want the thing that's valuable, morally valuable. So there's an internal story, an intelligible internal story here, and it's a nice reductive naturalistic one. Well, there's a question about whether we can naturalize the mind, but let's suppose we can. I don't need special values with special magnets on them to get people to be motivationally attached to moral values. I just need them to have desires, including desires about themselves, and be disposed to update those desires in various ways. That's something that hunks of meat and neurons can do. So that's good, because I think Lewis would have thought if you couldn't naturalize morality, you'd have to ditch it. But notice that this story is a partial story about morality. It's a story about moral value. And it's a story about the motivational connection, the connections between motivation and moral value. Now, if you're a consequentialist, you might think, gravy. You give me moral value, I'll give you the rest. Because what you want to do is a matter of what's morally valuable. Maybe how you want to be is a matter of what's morally valuable. Maybe forms of dispositions that tend to produce moral value or something more complicated. You give me moral value, I'll give you the moral universe. But if you're an anti-consequentialist, you'll think this has left out the main parts of the story. This has left out virtue and honor and duty. And those things can't be given us by moral value, at least not in a straightforward way, certainly not the way consequentialists want to. So the risk is Lewis has given us a story about why we should act like they're consequentialists, insofar as we're idealized in certain kinds of ways. He's given us a story about why there's a motivational connection between moral value and what we want. And so what we would do were we ideally practically rational. But he hasn't said anything about the other parts of morality. And if you think the other parts of morality are most of what morality is, and that a concentration on moral value gives you answers that are all wrong in everyday cases, you've really left out most of the really interesting part of meta-ethics. So here's the second tension. He gives us a meta-ethics, which would be a great general picture if you're a consequentialist. But it looks like it's a terrible picture, or a terribly incomplete picture, if you're an anti-consequentialist. And he's an anti-consequentialist. So I guess the question is, Lewis, I can see why I pursue what's morally valuable, but why on earth would I care about the other stuff? And when it conflicts with what I morally value, what's morally valuable to me, why don't I just go for the stuff that's morally valuable? Why wouldn't that be the practically rational thing for me to do? At least insofar as I'm idealized in various ways. So I think this is just a big gap in Lewis's meta-ethics. I think he needs to give us a story about how to naturalize virtue and how to naturalize obligation. And plausibly, not a story that goes by moral value. I mean, in principle, you could have a story that starts with moral value and gets to anti-consequentialism. But it's very much in the spirit of consequentialism to think that the story about moral value is the center part of the story about what you ought to do and how you ought to be as well. So what could Lewis stick in this gap? So one thing he could do, and this would be the easiest thing to do to kind of fit both of the things together, is become a pluralist agent relative consequentialist who rejects a lot of aggregation principles. You could say, yeah, maybe a relatively good person, the values they in fact have, what they want and what they want to want, will reflect what they would want in the relative idealized circumstances. And they would be motivated to do very well with respect to those values. Maybe not always maximized, maybe it gets trumped by other things, but at least be morally pushed in the direction of doing very well by the lights of moral value. And all the qualms Lewis has early on, we can accommodate a lot of them by going agent, relative, and pluralist. So, okay, honor is a matter of preferring to do more honorable things. Maybe me doing more honorable things is just more morally valuable than me doing fewer honorable things. Maybe that's the story about why I ought to pursue the honorable course of action. Or maybe when I'm virtuous, when I'm kind, maybe it's not the desire to be kind, but it's the desires, it's ranking highly outcomes where I do the kind thing, right? And that's part of what my psychological evaluative framework's like. And when I'm a good person, that's what my moral values are as well. But I think Lewis was consistent enough and strongly felt enough in his anti-consequentialism that I think he would think this is the wrong way round, or there's something wrong with this. Maybe it would get the right action for the wrong reasons or something. Right? That being honorable isn't a matter of valuing honorable outcomes. It's something else. One, I think the first thing he'd do out the gate is be relatively unopinionated. He'd say, yes, there's a good meta-ethics weighting that tells us the rest of the story about the meta-ethics of ethics, or the metaphysics of ethics, and it doesn't look like my story about moral value, and I don't know what it is yet. Another thing he could do, sometimes he flirts with moral error theory, sometimes he could think, yeah, if morality is correct, there's a good naturalization of all this stuff that doesn't look like moral value, but there isn't one, so it's a fiction or it's wrong or something else. I think he's temperamentally opposed to error theory. I think he'd rather pick a bad deserver than no deserver at all. My guess is he would want, this is probably implicit in what I've said so far, he would say, yeah, I've left out some chapters of the general matter ethical theory. I'm going to give you a story about virtue and its connection to motivation that doesn't go via moral value. I'm going to give you a story about obligation and its connection to motivation that doesn't go via moral value. And those stories are TBA. So here's a positive project I recommend to the Lewisian and people who are sympathetic with something like Lewis's approach. Give that naturalized story. Give the naturalized anti-consequentialist story that doesn't put moral value at the center of the metaphysics of ethics, but puts at the center, or at least as a crucial chapter in the naturalization of ethics, the thing that is really important for first order stuff. Put virtue, give us a direct story about virtue, or a direct story about obligation. I have one more piece of speculation, which is that once he starts thinking really carefully about marrying a messy, pointing in lots of directions, genuinely conflicted moral story with a theory of rational action, if he wants to keep the idea that the rational agent can be moral, or be very moral, maybe not ideally moral if morality points against itself, he might have started to want to give a less unified rational story. If moral considerations can point in different ways and there's nothing to say about how to unify them or sum them, maybe rational considerations could be like that too. He could still say, look, for a certain kind of idealization, my causal decision theory idealized agents, they don't have these problems. But relatively idealized versions of us maybe do have those problems. And so maybe some of the messiness he saw in ethics, he may have wanted to port over to a theory of rational decision. If you wanted to keep the idea that you could do very well by the lights of rational decision and very well by the lights of ethics at the same time. But that's pure speculation. So since I've got pure speculation, time to stop.